Ukraine has been on a knife edge in its war with Russia over the last year. During that time, it's been forced to confirm that its counteroffensive, which was designed to push Vladimir Putin's troops back, had failed, and it's been gradually losing territory to the Moscow steamroller. Russia has been taking ground. Avdiivka represents perhaps the largest victory for Putin over the last year of the war. The city, which Ukraine had transformed into a fortress, fell in 2024 after Moscow committed wave after wave of attack beginning in October 2023. Putin hailed the taking of Avdiivka as being hugely important for Russia, not least because controlling the city means Ukraine loses its main route into Donetsk. Along with that victory, Russia has made some serious inroads into Bakhmut, as well as taking several villages around Zaporizhia. Some commentators say there's now a stalemate on the front lines. That's not the case. Russia is advancing thanks to its ability to constantly bombard Ukrainian positions with artillery and troops. The war of attrition has been playing out in Putin's favor, not least of which because he has the funds to support his war effort at a time when Ukraine has started to run low. But that's all changed. And with that comes the possibility that Ukraine could be on the verge of destroying Putin's ambitions. All of which brings us to the key questions we'll answer in this video. What's the seismic change that's happened that will allow Ukraine to finally push back against Russia? And perhaps more crucially, what does this mean for Putin's ambitions, not just in Ukraine, but the rest of Europe? The answer to the first of those questions is simple. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have approved massive aid packages that are going to be a major help to Ukraine in the months to come. We'll start with the UK's package. On April 23, 2024, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak travelled to Poland for a meeting in which he aimed to strengthen the country's security ties with one of Europe's emerging military nations. During that meeting, he announced that the UK had approved a £500 million, approximately $620 million, aid package that would account for the country's largest ever delivery of military equipment to a wartime ally. The announcement brought the UK's funding total in Ukraine up to $3.7 billion for the financial year, with most of the money going toward funding equipment that Ukraine desperately needs to fend off the Russian offensive. Among that equipment will be 60 boats, including raiding craft, dive boats, and maritime guns that can be used both to fend off any Russian naval offenses as well as provide Ukraine with options for making inroads into Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. The UK will also provide 400 military vehicles split between 78 all-terrain vehicles, 160 Husky vehicles, which come with protective armour, and a further 162 armoured vehicles of different types. Plus, the UK will bolster Ukraine's missile stocks. The money will pay for 1,600 air defence and strike missiles that may help Ukraine deal with Russia's constant bombardments. Add to that a small number of Storm Shadow long-range guided missiles, which are capable of traveling for about 150 miles, providing Ukraine with the ability to strike Russian targets from a great distance, and you have a comprehensive equipment package. And that's not all. The UK will also provide Ukraine's ground soldiers with 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, as well as support from its engineering industry. There's also mention of supplying drones in the press release announcing the aid package. The UK's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps was bullish when speaking about the package, pointing out that the UK was the first to provide Ukraine with modern tanks, long-range missiles, and NLAW anti-tank missiles. Now we are going even further. We will never let the world forget the existential battle Ukraine is fighting, and with our enduring support, they will win. Those are big words. But as impressive as the UK's aid package may be, alone it would not be enough to turn the tide of war in Ukraine's favour. At best, it would give Ukraine enough ammunition to defend itself for a few more months, but more is needed for Ukraine to stand any chance of destroying Putin's hope of taking the country. Enter the United States. After months of political wrangling, the US Senate has finally approved a massive $95 billion aid package. Signed and sealed by President Joe Biden, that money will go to supporting Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, with the latter getting the lion's share of the funding. According to the BBC, it's expected that $61 billion of that money will be dedicated to providing military aid to Kyiv, making the package about 10 times the size of that being delivered by the UK. The package has been a long time coming. As Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pointed out, after more than 6 months of hard work and many twists and turns in the road, America sends a message to the entire world: we will not turn our back on you. Defense One offers more details on how Ukraine will likely spend the money. It says that $13.7 billion will go to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which works on behalf of Kyiv to procure new weapons. Another $1.6 billion will go to a similar weapons acquisition scheme, the Foreign Military Financing Program, which is overseen by the US State Department. Add to that $13.4 billion that will be used to replace weapons the US has already sent over that have since been lost in the war, along with funding for further training of Ukrainian troops, and you have a substantial aid package, albeit one that comes with a few strings attached. Those strings include provisions in the bill that the US can withdraw the funding if Ukraine doesn't spend the money in a way that the US sees as fitting. That seems unlikely. America is already working closely with Ukraine in terms of how it spends the funds, with most of it being dedicated to purchasing American equipment that Ukraine needs anyway. Ukraine can deal with that. It's also important to point out that Ukraine isn't getting all of that money, or the equipment that it will buy, in one go. Defense One says that the first tranche of weapons the US will send to Ukraine under the new aid package will have a total of $1 billion, about a 60th of the total aid. The package is likely to include anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, along with 155mm shells, armored vehicles, and long-range rockets. Unfortunately, there are no specific numbers at the time of creating this video, though it's safe to assume they'll be somewhat similar to the UK's. And there's more. Along with finally passing the bill for aid to Ukraine, the US House of Representatives has passed another bill that could be just as damaging to Putin. A bill that allows the US to seize Russian assets held in American banks before transferring them to Ukraine for its war effort. That bill still needs to make it through the Senate, but if it passes, it would represent a bold move by the United States that could see it free up around $67 billion in assets that would essentially double the aid package it's sending to Ukraine. That bill could also serve as a trigger for other nations to do the same. After all, the $67 billion in frozen assets that the US holds is just a fifth of the $300 billion plus of frozen assets held around the world. According to Russia's central bank, Moscow has around $207 billion invested in the euro, along with $37 billion invested in the British pound. There are also tens of billions of dollars invested into the Japanese yen and Canadian and Australian dollars. Imagine what would happen if the nations controlling these currencies all followed America's lead. Ukraine would suddenly have access to over $300 billion of Russia's frozen money, which it could use to fund its defense. Of course, Putin has been quick to call any type of seizure illegal and has threatened retaliation if it happens. So the fact that the US even has a bill at all, never mind one that's passed through the House of Representatives and seems to have support of key Republican Party players, suggests that the wider world is ready to take a more aggressive approach to dealing with Putin's attempts to take Ukraine. And that brings us neatly to the second question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why does the renewed aid the United Kingdom and the United States providing to Ukraine spell such bad news for Putin? There are several answers to this question, starting with the most obvious one. The aid bolsters Ukraine's defense at a time when Russia has been slowly pushing it back in a devastating war of attrition. Right now, Russia controls around 18% of Ukrainian land, which it's managed to gain by virtue of having more equipment and manpower. That equipment advantage has come to the fore in Russia's reliance on constant missile and drone barrages over Ukrainian cities, which are supplemented by its ability to send soldier after soldier into the fight with seemingly no sign of letting up. That strategy is unlikely to change in the short term. In 2024 alone, Russia has already captured 138 square miles of Ukrainian territory, and if Ukraine's defense intelligence heads are to be believed, is planning to launch a renewed offensive at some point during May 2024. That offensive will likely focus on the small town of Chaziv Yar in Donetsk. That would be bad news for Ukraine, because the capture of that town would open the way to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, two Ukrainian strongholds in the Donbas region. Chatham House also believes it's likely that Putin will intensify Russia's missile and drone strikes, focusing on Ukrainian infrastructure, logistical routes, and industrial base. All have suffered in recent months from a lack of air defenses. And it's here where we may see the tide start to turn. As part of its aid package, the United States is supposedly providing a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine, with that system being capable of shooting down many of the types of missiles that Russia will use in these attacks. Germany has also committed to sending one, with Greece and Spain also facing increasing pressure to transfer their Patriot systems to Ukraine. Add to that the money Ukraine can now access, which it would use to purchase more Patriot missile systems, along with the ammunition they require, and the country is now in a better position to defend itself against missile strikes. Why is that such bad news for Putin? It's possible that Russia might start running low on missiles if it has to start firing more to achieve the same results it enjoyed before Ukraine got access to these new Patriot systems. Back in January 2023, Ukrainian intelligence officers started to suggest that Russia was running low on its ballistic missile stocks. A Ukrainian Air Force official named Yuri Inat suggested that Moscow had fewer than 100 of its Iskander missiles left due to its repeated strikes throughout 2022, forcing it to rely on its weaker S-300 and S-400 systems. The S-300s date back to the days of the Soviet Union, making them less reliable than their supposedly dwindling modern alternatives. Their use, suggested Inat, meant that Russia must be running low on ballistic missiles. But that was over a year ago, and the barrages kept coming. Still, it highlights the equipment and munitions challenges both face in what has become the modern example of what industrialized ground warfare looks like. According to Reuters, Russia has already fired 8,000 missiles, along with sending 4,630 Shahid drones into Ukraine. It's making and buying more, but that rate of use will eventually mean Moscow starts to run low, with Ukraine being aided by its new missile defense systems to put an even more severe dent in Moscow's missile stockpiles. In short, Putin may not be able to rely on his missile barrages for as long as he would have done without the aid packages. And given that those packages include supplying Ukraine with more missiles of its own, he may also find that the ground Russia has already taken in the country could be subjected to the very same missile strategies he used to take that ground in the first place. But Putin has a workaround for that problem, one he's already been using to great effect in Ukraine: glide bombs. In an interview with the UK's Times radio station, Professor Michael Clarke, a fellow of King's College in London, discussed Russia's use of these bombs. Specifically, he highlighted the Fab 500 and Fab 1500 variants, which are capable of carrying warheads weighing 1,102 pounds and 3,306 pounds respectively. These are very old bombs. They're not equipped with the precision-guided systems that modern missiles have, though their payloads are so massive that it doesn't really matter. As long as Russia can drop the bombs in proximity of their targets, they don't need direct strikes. The bombs can still cause damage. Clarke points out that Moscow has found a way to fit small wings to these bombs, giving them the ability to glide towards a target after being dropped from an aircraft. That's been huge for Putin. One of Russia's planes can drop a glide bomb from 30,000 feet in the air while being 50 miles behind the front lines and still know that it's likely to hit its target. The bombs were crucial to Russia's taking of Avdiivka. According to Le Monde, one Ukrainian fighter said, "These bombs completely destroy any position. All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one KAB, a term used for the glide bombs. And they drop 60 to 80 pieces on us in just one day," the soldier concluded. Countering those bombs is going to be a huge challenge for Ukraine. The only thing Ukraine can really do, according to Clarke, is take out or chase off the Russian planes that are dropping the bombs in the first place. That's where the Patriot systems may come into play again, as their range is such that they can target and hit Russian planes stationed 50 miles behind the front lines, potentially taking them out of the game before they can launch their deadly payloads. Again, another huge boon for Ukraine. If it's able to get its hands on more fighter jets, the Netherlands will provide it with 6 that were previously meant for sale in the US, as of a February 2024 report. It could even take the fight to those bomb-dropping planes. These are all little steps. And given that the funding is staggered, as well as Ukraine having to wait for equipment to arrive before it can deploy it, it's likely that Russia will still manage to advance in the near term. But with the new defensive systems in place, Ukraine can stem the bleeding and potentially take advantage of Russia's munitions starting to dry up at a key point where it's receiving a fresh load of weaponry and equipment. Ukraine will also be able to counter the glide bombs, albeit only partially, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield to the point where Ukraine can hold its cities for longer. And that ability to hold for longer is another reason why the UK's and America's aid packages could destroy Putin's ambitions. It will lead to Russia losing more soldiers. In his interview, Clarke highlights that Russia is still losing around 900 soldiers per day to a Ukraine that is war-weary and running out of equipment. It's been able to sustain those losses because of the sheer size of its army. According to Global Firepower, Russia ranks 5th in the world for active military personnel with 1.32 million, and it has 2 million reservists along with 250,000 paramilitary members. Moscow won't run out of people anytime soon. Its problem comes in funneling those huge numbers into Ukraine, which has become a slightly easier task now it controls territory in the country. But even with that territory, losing 900 people per day is a massive burden. Now that Ukraine has enough money to purchase more artillery shells and small arms ammunition, its ground troops will be able to kill even more of Putin's soldiers. That doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine will be able to force a counterattack with this funding, according to Clarke. But it does mean that Russia will be forced to sustain higher losses than it has over the last few months, potentially weakening its hold on territory it's taken during 2023 and the first part of 2024. In short, Ukraine now has what it needs to start pushing Russia back. And that gives Ukraine 2 things that it hasn't had in a long time: breathing room and the ability to plan for the future. Now that it's better able to fend off attacks, Ukraine's frontline forces won't be in the state of panic and chaos that Russia has placed them under for much of 2024. They'll be able to launch coordinated attacks with the equipment to back them up, as well as better coordinate their defenses against Russian assaults. Clark speculates that this could slow down the Russian advance to the point where the war returns to the stalemate position it seemed to be during the beginning of 2023, giving Ukraine valuable time to plan how to use its new resources both to defend and attack. As for the control issue, Ukraine now has stability in terms of knowing what's coming in and where. It knows that the UK is going to deliver 60 boats, 400 vehicles, and 1,600 missiles, with that knowledge allowing it to plan ahead on how to maximize that equipment rather than being in a position where it has to constantly scramble to react to Russian attacks. The same will go for America's military aid package. It all feeds into giving Ukraine more control in the conflict and buoys the morale of troops that have been seeing their supplies constantly dwindling over the past year. That's not what Putin wants. As Clark points out in the Radio Times interview, Putin's strategy has been to slowly put the squeeze on Ukraine by forcing it to face up to what felt like insurmountable odds. He knew Ukraine was running low on equipment. All he had to do was keep pushing, slowly but surely, perhaps to the point where he could force a political crisis in the country. That crisis may have been the ousting of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and opening the door to a new leader who was sympathetic to Putin's ambitions. A leader who might hand over the territory Russia has already captured to keep the peace. That's not going to happen anymore, at least not for the next year, according to Clark. He highlights these new aid packages could restore Ukraine to the point where it's again able to expend the 10,000 artillery shells it was using to keep Russia at bay near the beginning of the war, creating a stalemate situation again right as Russia looks set to push deeper into Ukraine. Clark believes that Putin thought that the aid packages, particularly the one from the United States, wouldn't get through the Senate. Now he faces a situation where Ukraine has a renewed flow of supplies that will increase troop morale and could lead to Russia's soldiers facing a much harder fight than they faced for the last year. Does that mean Putin will be forced to leave Ukraine? Not necessarily. But there's another element to this aid package that is huge for the potential outcome of the war and may play the biggest role in destroying Putin's ambitions. It's a sign that the rest of Europe is waking up to the threat that Russia poses. Take the UK as a perfect example. When speaking about the country's most recent $620 million package, Rishi Sunak made it clear that the package represented the UK getting on a war footing for the first time in decades. The aid pledge came with another that would see the UK increase its defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, amounting to around $93 billion over the next 6 years, with Sunak calling it the biggest strengthening of our national defense for a generation. He went on to point out that the world is the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, while warning against taking a complacent approach that would see Russia take Ukraine and potentially turn its attention to other European countries. The country also intends to invest around $12 billion into ammunition production, likely as a result of having seen Russia's tactics in Ukraine. There are signs of the British war machine starting to activate elsewhere. Beyond sending aid to Ukraine, the UK has also announced that it intends to deploy some of its Typhoon fighter jets to Poland, giving Poland more options when it comes to policing its skies. It's not outside the realms of possibility that those jets will be there to keep an eye on what Russia does should it take Ukraine. After all, as AP News points out, Poland has already seen Russian incursions into its airspace since the war in Ukraine began. Even more worrying for Putin is that it's not just the UK that's on notice. The rest of Europe is quickly figuring out that the Russian war machine might target them next. Before the UK and the US announced their aid bills, the EU had agreed to send $53 billion in financial support between 2024 and 27. Rather than being dedicated to funding military equipment, the EU said the money could be used to keep the country's administration running. More bad news for Putin, as well as paying for salaries, pensions, and public services. So there's funding coming from two fronts, military and civilian aid, that could strengthen Ukraine in its fight against Russia. America's substantial aid package also places pressure on many European countries to follow suit with packages of their own. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have contributed massive amounts already, with the latter having committed 1.5% of its GDP to Ukraine, with Estonia and Lithuania committing 1.8%. Germany is delivering a Patriot system to Ukraine, as mentioned earlier, with the country already having established itself as the biggest supplier of military aid to Ukraine behind the United States. And of course, we have France's President Macron talking about the possibility of sending NATO troops into Ukraine to fight Russia is still on the table, even if the rest of NATO's leaders claim that's an impossibility. These are far from the only examples, but all prove that Europe is increasingly concerned about Putin's ambitions, both for Ukraine itself and for the rest of the continent, should he succeed in taking Ukraine. Again, that's not what Putin wanted. His invasion of Ukraine was meant to be a smash and grab. The country was supposed to roll over in a matter of months, accept that it would become part of Russia, and the rest of Europe would just have to deal with it. Instead, Ukraine has held on. It's now being buoyed by financial aid that will allow it to fight for another year, and Putin is having to watch as the rest of Europe mobilizes production while committing even more money to Ukraine, so it'll be ready to fight if Putin turns his attentions beyond Ukraine. It all adds up to Russia potentially losing steam in Ukraine. Putin has already responded by threatening to increase the rate of missile strikes in Ukraine in response to America's aid bill passing. Through his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, Putin said that Russia will increasingly target storage bases and logistics centers for Western weapons in response. Russian propaganda has also started the nuclear weapons conversation again, with Newsweek reporting on April 29th that state TV channel Russia 1 news anchor Dmitry Kiselyov has talked about Russian nuclear launches on the air. He said that if NATO troops enter Ukraine, Russian nukes would not only disarm France in an instant, a clear shot at Macron, but would target American decision-making centers. Those words may not come directly from Putin, but they come from a prominent figure on Russian state-sponsored television, meaning we can assume Putin approves. And as Clark concludes in his interview with Times Radio, the renewed threats of nuclear war could be a sign that Russia is worried. It knows Ukraine is going to get a heavy injection of military equipment, and that injection may just be a heavy enough dose to stop the Russian war machine in its tracks. But what do you think? Could the announcement of financial aid from the UK and the US help Ukraine to turn the tide in the war? Is it all a case of too little too late? And is Putin genuinely worried about the rest of Europe mobilizing in the wake of his invasion? Are his plans going to come crumbling down? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.